The third macrostructure involves chiastic links between sections 2 and 4. A concentration of 6 prohibitions gives unity to the verses 27 through 31. That is, in section 4, the first block. These group into 3 sets of 2, appearing in 27 and 28, then 29 and 30, and finally verse 31. Verse 31 has 2 prohibitions pressed into it, whereas the others have 1 prohibition per verse. The dynamic progression operating in these 3 sets of prohibitions, that is 27 and 8, 9 and 30, and then 2 and 31, they constitute a microstructural feature, the progression does, and so that will be described a little bit later under microstructural features. But the correlation that links these 3 in section 4 with 3 other instructions, quatrains, that is verse pairs, in section 2, this merits classification as a macro feature. Consider first the initial instruction set that we find here in section 4. It's a warning against withholding what is owed to another. You can see it in verses 27 and 28. What is owed implies something of tangible worth, such as paying wages due or returning a borrowed farm implement, perhaps. The first category then in section 4, that is remitting tangible worth, recalls the category addressed last in the 3 instructional quatrains found back in section 2. And now we're referring to verse 9. Honor out of your substance from your revenue. Substance and revenue refer to payment or remission out of tangible goods. Consider next the second instruction set down in section 4. That consists of verses 29 and 30. These draw attention to the term evil, which in Hebrew is ra'ah, naming evil in each verse. Do not scheme evil against your neighbor, verse 29. Do not level baseless charges against a mortal if he has not worked evil against you, verse 30. Although these trace to a root that appears often in Proverbs, the root ra'ah, that root occurs once more in chapter 3. That other instance of ra'ah appears back in section 2, and it's located within the second instruction set found there, that is, within 7 and 8, namely 7b. Revere the Lord and veer away from evil. The third and final instruction set of section 4, namely verse 31, ends with this phrase, any of his ways. Now the first instruction, quatrain, back in section 2, contains the following phrase, all of your ways. That is verse 6a. We read, direct your confidence toward the Lord with your entire mind, and towards your own insight do not tend to support yourself. In all your ways, know him. Verse 6a. Since the term any and the term all both represent the same Hebrew word, these 2 instructions, one in section 2, one in section 4, differ only in the pronominal designation, his versus your. This phrase, which would read all and then a possessive pronoun and ways, like all your ways or all his ways, does not occur elsewhere within Proverbs 3. Since the sequence of connections from section 2 reverses when it comes to section 4, it produces a chiastic pattern. This leads to the following observations as we proceed sequentially through the prohibition sets there in section 4. First, both tiers of relationships, that is, divine and also horizontal with the humans, both specify that healthy relationships are not limited to the psychological or emotional realms, but require ethical handling of tangible assets as well. Honor the Lord from your wealth, and in human relationships, don't withhold payment or remission of something that is good. Second, In both tiers of relationships, the sage makes a point of censuring behavior that's classed as evil. By reading the respective quatrains side by side, that is, reading 7 and 8 alongside 29 and 30, the sage's concept of what is evil grows clearer. It stems from an arrogant disregard of others, we see in verse 7, and it may lead one covertly to scheme against them despite their innocence. We see this in 29 and 30. The cost of such misconduct may manifest itself in personal breakdown and profound dissatisfaction. This is implied by the inverse of verse 8. Third, the topic of making a crucial choice emerges when one compares the portions that are joined by the phrases all your ways, 5 and 6, and any of his ways in 31. In verses 5 and 6, the sage is urging the youth to choose in favor of the Lord and against relying entirely on his own insight when he is deciding who is he going to actually trust. Trust the Lord, says the sage. When we come to verse 31, the sage employs the word choose explicitly after the parallel term envy, which reflects a sort of preference, doesn't it? Here's how it reads in 31, do not envy a person characterized by violence, nor choose any of his ways. It is this third rung that suggests a rationale that may explain why the sage decided to chiastically invert 3 parts. That is, the sequence in section 4 reverses the order of concepts that originated in section 2. You see, the sage often constructs a lecture so that it will draw to a close by confronting the youth with binary contrasts. He ends by pressing the youth to decide which option he will embrace. So it is rhetorically efficient, as the sage nears the close of the lecture spanning Proverbs 3, for him to identify that component where choice emerges with greatest clarity, ensuring that it appears last in the sequence, leaving the youth with this thought. Since that component involving choice appeared first among the 3 elements in section 2, this fact may have led to ordering the second and third so that chiasm would result when choice appears last in section 4. The last macrostructural feature involves progression of thought when we move from section 3 to section 4. The last macrostructural feature involves progression of thought when moving from section 3 to section 4. The behaviors prohibited in verses 27 to 31 of section 4 describe the sort of conduct that one might expect of a person who was trying to avert the destabilization described at the close of section 3. If a person were unaware that the Lord pledged his security, one might be inclined to glom onto security for himself in 3 ways. By hoarding resources, corresponding to verses 27 and 8, by hijacking justice, corresponding to 29 and 30, or in a comprehensive summation, by behaving violently in any number of ways toward an undeserving neighbor. Now we are ready to explore more closely the microstructural features that operate within Proverbs 3. First, notice verses 1 and 2. Here we see that there is an imperative, verse 1, which is supported by an incentive, verse 2. These follow the very first feature of all, which is a vocative summons, my son, that opens the entire poem. A second microstructural feature involves wisdom commendation, leading to wisdom content in section 1. The wisdom commendation that opens section 1 is calculated to secure a receptive attitude on the part of the youth. We're talking here about the first 2 verses of the poem. As a result, he will be more inclined to embrace the wisdom content concerning healthy relationships that immediately follows, and that dominates verses 3 and 4. So commendation leads to content. The next structure involves 4 cycles of imperative plus incentives in section 2. The sage's instructions concerning relationship with the divine in section 2 consist of a 4-fold cycle of imperatives, each of which is followed by an incentive of one sort or another. The first 3 cycles make up block 2a, that is verses 5 through 10. And in these, the sage urges the youth to respond to the divine with confidence, with reverence, and with material honor. Each instruction is followed either by an assured incentive, such as verse 6b, or by a statement of hope, which are found in verses 8 and 10. The 4th cycle of imperative plus incentive stands apart from the first 3, advising the youth not to recoil from the reproof that those first 3 would have delivered to him. The 4th cycle occurs in verses 11 and 12. In this final cycle, a reassuring explanation operates as the incentive in verse 12. The cadence of incentives or benefits that cycles through section 2 segues seamlessly into the wisdom commendation poem of section 3, which itself amounts to one grand incentive statement advocating for the pursuit of wisdom. Pursue wisdom on account of, incentivized by, its incredible worth, which is the content of section 3. The next microstructure involves the distinctive character of the first imperative cycle, back in section 2. Let's take a look at that. Among the 3 core instructions of section 2, that is spanning verses 5 through 10, the desirable consequence that's paired with the first instruction projects the highest measure of certitude. We find it in verse 6 in this expression, "And he," that is the Lord, "personally will straighten your paths." The remaining 2 desirable consequences that are found in verse 8 and 10 are not quite so certain. They recede to a level of hoped-for results rather than assured outcomes. The next microstructure involves content-based block groupings within section 3. The 2 blocks comprising section 3 are differentiated by content. Although both blocks commend wisdom, the first does so by description, and here we're referring to block 3a, verses 13 through 20. While the second block accomplishes the same, that is, a wisdom commendation, through prescription, with imperatives plus incentives. And here we see the imperatives, verse 21, and also 25. The next microstructure involves a dual theme introduction to the 2 blocks of section 3. Notice the shift from past to future in the first verse of section 3, that is, verse 13. This anticipates the shift from past in block 3a to future in block 3b. 3a is 13 to 20, 3b is 21 to 26. Thus, the orientation of the first verse of the section, 13a, is past-oriented. It reads, "How fortunate a mortal who has found wisdom," referring to the past, while the orientation of the second half of that same line, verse 13b, is instead future-oriented. It reads, "A mortal who keeps on obtaining insight." To underscore this dual theme transition, the sage employed the same shift, that is, past to future, again, now in the last verse of block 3a, namely verse 20, at the transition point between the past-oriented block and its future-oriented counterpart. Thus, verse 20a looks to the past. By his knowledge, the depths were, past tense, split apart. While in 20b, the sage turns the youth's attention to what may befall him in the future. It reads, "And clouds may yet overflow with rain, a future possibility of disaster. The past to future transition is a trace device, leading one to the sage's main point in all of section 3. Just as in the past the Lord remained in wise and sovereign control, even when the world was breaking up, referring to the Noahic deluge in Block 3a, so also the Lord may be depended on to retain wise and sovereign control when future disasters may erupt, perilously close to the youth. This is the tone of protection that we see in Block 3b. The youth must not allow such periods of severe destabilization to derail his determination to behave wisely. That's verse 21. Survival will be achieved not by sacrificing wisdom in those times of distress, but by resolutely treasuring it. That's the message of verse 22. When his world seems to be falling apart, the confidence and security that the youth so desperately seeks will itself unfold as a derivative of maintaining wise conduct. That's the message of 23 and 24. Wisdom is able to deliver comprehensive security on account of wisdom's supernatural concomitant, the nearness of the Lord. That's the message of 25 and 26. The next microstructure involves content-based groupings of units within Block 3a, that is verses 13 to 18. As the sage reviews the worth of wisdom in these verses, he unfolds a survey that compares wisdom to the worth of other assets, whether tangible, verses 14 and 15, or intangible, verses 16 and 17. Those are encased by an inclusio in the first verse, 13, and the last, 18. And that will be described just a moment or two later. In contrast to that first unit, that is verses 13 to 18, the second unit shifts from asset comparison to a rehearsal of wisdom's legendary performance in the remote past at the very dawn of creation. Here we are referring to verses 19 and 20. So in this way, Unit 3a1 distinguishes itself from 3a2. That is, verses 13 to 18 distinguish themselves from 19 and 20. They do this by a comparison of worth of assets in the first unit, shifting to a rehearsal of wisdom's legendary performance in the second. The next microstructural feature involves inclusio and palistrophe in Unit 3a1, that is verses 13 to 18. As noted a moment ago, content involving wisdom's asset portfolio characterizes Unit 3a1, 13 to 18. The formal feature of inclusio endorses those same outer boundaries with exceptional precision, since the first word of verse 13 and the last word of verse 18 involve the concept of being fortunate, the Hebrew root ashar. The following cumulative pattern then emerges. We have an inclusio at the outer edges, 13 and 18, which encases the quatrains, two quatrains that involve tangible versus intangible assets. Tangible, 14, 15, and intangible, 16 and 17. Taken together, this forms a compact four-member palistrophe. Our exploration of microstructures will continue in the next video segment.